All right, get ready, because today we're taking a deep dive into one of the most well-known stories in the Bible, the book of Jonah.
It's a classic, right?
I mean, we've got a prophet running from God, a giant fish, a city on the verge of destruction.
Yeah, it's definitely got that epic, almost cinematic feel.
Definitely. But as we'll see, there's a lot more going on beneath the surface of this ancient blockbuster.
Right. The book of Jonah takes us on a wild adventure, but it's also a deep exploration of some pretty profound themes: obedience, mercy, and the surprising nature of God, just to name a few.
Okay, so let's set the scene. God calls Jonah to preach to Nineveh, the capital of Assyria. Now, this wasn't just any ordinary city.
No, not at all. Nineveh was massive, a sprawling metropolis.
And they had a pretty bad reputation, right?
Yeah, they were known for their brutality, their cruelty. They were considered the enemy of Israel.
So you can imagine Jonah's reaction when God tells him to go warn these people about their impending doom.
I mean, talk about an uncomfortable situation.
And what does Jonah do? Does he grab his prophet gear and head straight to Nineveh?
Nope, not even close. He decides to run away.
He runs away from God.
He does. He books passage on a ship going in the opposite direction. He sets sail for Tarshish,
Which was...
as far away from Nineveh as you could get in the ancient world. It's like he's trying to put as much distance between himself and God's command as possible.
Wow. So he thinks he can actually hide from God. I mean, come on. Didn't he know God is everywhere?
It seems a bit ridiculous, right? But it's also incredibly human. We often try to avoid uncomfortable situations, especially when they challenge our beliefs or make us face things we'd rather ignore.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that.
And it's not just that he's avoiding a task. The text actually says that he's trying to escape from the presence of the Lord. Like he thinks he can physically outrun God's reach.
It's a pretty powerful image, isn't it? How we sometimes react when confronted with something difficult, something that goes against our preconceived notions.
Absolutely. So Jonah sets sail, hoping to put as much distance between himself and Nineveh as possible. But things don't exactly go according to plan, do they?
Not at all. In fact, they go very, very wrong. A massive storm erupts, and these experienced sailors find themselves battling for their lives.
I mean, we're talking huge waves crashing over the deck, wind howling like crazy.
It's intense.
Oh.
They start throwing cargo overboard, trying to lighten the ship, desperate to stay afloat.
Yeah, it's a pretty terrifying scene.
And meanwhile, where's Jonah during all this?
Well, believe it or not, he's sound asleep below deck. Can you imagine that?
I can't help but laugh at the irony. These pagan sailors are terrified, praying to their gods for mercy, while the prophet of the one true God is snoozing peacefully through the chaos.
It's a pretty stark contrast, isn't it? You know, it really underscores that disconnect between Jonah's knowledge of God and his actions. He knows the truth, but he's choosing to ignore it.
So the sailors, in their panic, decide to cast lots. Like rolling dice to see who might be responsible for this divine wrath.
It was a common practice in ancient cultures, a way to discern the will of the gods.
And surprise, surprise, the lot falls on Jonah.
Busted.
Well, it's interesting because the sailors aren't just looking for a scapegoat, someone to blame.
No, they're genuinely trying to understand why this storm has been unleashed upon them. They want answers.
And they actually start questioning Jonah, asking him about his God, his purpose, why he's on this ship.
Yeah, they're desperate to figure out how to appease whatever deity they've offended.
And Jonah, to his credit, doesn't hold back. He tells them straight up, I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. He's basically admitting that he's the reason for their misfortune.
That's a pretty bold move, isn't it? I mean, here's Jonah in the middle of a raging storm, confessing his disobedience to a group of pagan sailors.
Right. He could have easily kept quiet, tried to blend in, but he doesn't. He owns up to it.
And then what does he do? He tells them to throw him overboard.
Yeah. He volunteers to be tossed into the raging sea.
He does. I mean, can you imagine the look on their faces? They must have thought he was crazy.
I'd be terrified.
They were definitely hesitant. You can sense their reluctance in the text. They try rowing back to shore, hoping to spare Jonah.
I mean, who wouldn't?
Right. But the storm just intensifies. It's like nature itself is conspiring against Jonah, forcing him to face the consequences of his actions.
So they finally give in and throw him overboard.
Yeah, with heavy hearts, they toss him into the churning sea. And just as he's sinking into the depths,
a giant fish appears.
A giant fish appears and swallows him whole.
Okay, now that's a twist. Okay, so we've left Jonah bobbing around in the belly of this giant fish. I mean, what must that have been like? Dark, smelly, cramped. Talk about a bad case of indigestion.
It's definitely one of the more memorable images in the Bible, no doubt about that. But then, just as suddenly as he was swallowed, the fish spits Jonah out onto dry land.
You'd think he'd be grateful, right? Humbled by the experience, maybe ready to hit the ground running, head straight to Nineveh, and deliver God's message.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? I mean, after a close encounter like that, you'd expect a little more cooperation.
Right.
But Jonah's journey, well, it's far from over. He's still grappling with his own prejudices, his own reluctance to fully embrace God's mission. It's like he just can't let go of his resentment towards the Ninevites.
So what happens? Does God give up on him?
No, surprisingly not.
Hmm.
God gives Jonah a second chance, tells him once again to go to Nineveh and preach. And this time, Jonah actually obeys.
He does, finally.
He does, but it's not exactly a joyful obedience. You can almost sense the reluctance in the text. He's still wrestling with his feelings.
And remember, we're talking about Nineveh here, this massive, sprawling city.
Yeah, it was a 3-day walk across, just to give you an idea of the scale.
3 days.
Yeah.
So can you imagine Jonah trudging through the streets, delivering his message of doom and gloom?
Well, it's almost like he's going through the motions, you know? Still not fully invested in the outcome, and his message, well, it's pretty blunt. 40 days, he says, and Nineveh will be overthrown. Short, sweet, and straight to the point.
No mincing words there. So what's the reaction? What do the Ninevites do when they hear this prophecy of impending doom?
You might expect them to laugh it off,
Right.
right? Or ignore him completely. Maybe even get angry, threaten him.
Yeah, I mean, that would be my first reaction, I think.
But their response is actually quite remarkable. From the king all the way down to the average citizen, they take Jonah's message to heart. They declare a fast, dress in sackcloth, which was a sign of mourning and repentance, and they cry out to God for mercy.
Wait, so they actually believe him? This entire city repents based on the word of a foreign prophet who, let's be honest, hasn't exactly been the picture of obedience himself.
It really is a powerful testament to the power of a simple message, you know? Even when delivered by a less than perfect messenger. And their repentance, it wasn't just some superficial act, it was genuine. They were truly turning away from their wickedness.
Even the king.
Especially the king. He takes off his royal robes, puts on sackcloth, and sits in ashes.
Talk about a grand gesture. I mean, humbling himself like that,
Right.
especially after hearing a prediction from essentially an enemy.
And his words, they're quite revealing. He says, who knows, perhaps God might be willing to change his mind and relent. He's acknowledging their wrongdoing, but he's also expressing this deep belief in the possibility of God's mercy, a mercy that extends even to a people known for their cruelty.
And then, what happens next?
Well, this is where we get to the heart of the book of Jonah. God sees their sincere repentance, and he relents. He spares Nineveh.
You'd think Jonah would be relieved, right? Maybe even a little bit happy.
Yeah, you would think so, wouldn't you? But
Oh boy, here we go again. Jonah's not happy, is he?
not even a little bit. In fact, he's furious.
He's angry that God showed mercy. I don't get this guy.
Jonah's reaction is one of the most perplexing parts of the story. Here he is, this prophet who's witnessed God's power firsthand, and yet he's clinging to this narrow view of justice and punishment. It's like he can't grasp the idea of God extending grace to those he deems unworthy.
So what does he do? I mean, does he confront God? Argue with him?
He basically throws a temper tantrum.
A temper tantrum.
He does. He leaves the city, stomps off, and sets up camp outside the walls, sulking in the scorching sun.
I have to admit, I kind of admire his dedication to being grumpy. He's really committed to his displeasure.
Well, it's at this point that God, in his infinite patience, decides to use a rather unconventional teaching tool, a plant.
A plant. Where's this going?
Okay, so God provides Jonah with this fast-growing plant, giving him some much-needed shade from the harsh sun. And Jonah, well, he's ecstatic, genuinely happy about this simple plant. More so, it seems, than he was about the salvation of an entire city.
It's almost comical, isn't it? This prophet who's witnessed miracles and prophecies, and he's gushing over a plant.
It's funny, but it also highlights a crucial point, you know? It exposes Jonah's misplaced priorities. He cared more about his own comfort than the lives of thousands of people.
That's a pretty stark realization.
Yeah.
So what happens to this miraculous plant? Does it thrive and provide Jonah with years of blissful shade?
Not exactly. Just as quickly as it sprouted, the plant withers and dies, leaving Jonah exposed to the relentless sun.
Poor Jonah can't catch a break, can he?
And once again, he's miserable, wishing for death. Talk about a roller coaster of emotions.
But what does God do?
Well, this is where God's gentle rebuke comes in. He simply asks Jonah, is it right for you to be angry about the plant?
And Jonah, does he finally get it? Apologize for being such a grump.
He doubles down. He says, yes, I am angry enough to die.
Jonah. He's really not helping himself here.
But that stubbornness, it's exactly what God is trying to address. He uses the plant as this analogy to deliver a powerful message about compassion and perspective.
How so?
Well, God points out that Jonah had no hand in the plant's growth or demise. It just was. And yet, Jonah felt these intense emotions towards it.
It's like God is saying, look, Jonah, you're upset about a plant that lived for a few days, but you begrudge these people, my creation, a chance at a new beginning. Where's your compassion?
Exactly. God is reminding Jonah that he cares for all of creation, even the people of Nineveh. Despite their past, they're still capable of turning back to him.
So the plant was a test, a way to reveal Jonah's true feelings.
I think it was more like a mirror, reflecting Jonah's own struggles back at him. And it's a lesson that extends far beyond the pages of this ancient book. It's a challenge for us, for all of us, to examine our own compassion and biases.
Right. Do we sometimes find ourselves rooting for the downfall of others, even when they're genuinely trying to change?
Yeah.
It's a tough question, one that we all need to grapple with. We all have our own prejudices, our own Ninevehs that we'd rather see judged than forgiven.
The book of Jonah really forces us to confront those feelings head on, It makes us grapple with this idea of a God whose mercy is vast, expansive, and often quite unexpected.
Well, here we are at the end of Jonah's crazy adventure. It's a story that's been told and retold for centuries, right? And yet it still feels so relevant, so full of twists and turns.
It's not your typical happy ending, is it? I mean, it leaves us with more questions than answers, really.
Yeah, it kind of makes you wonder, what happened next?
Right. The book ends so abruptly. Did Jonah finally get it? Did he learn his lesson? Did he ever come to terms with God's mercy?
We never really find out.
And maybe that's the point, Maybe it's designed to make us think, to challenge those assumptions we have about God, about obedience, about compassion, about what it really means to follow God's call, even when it leads us to places we'd rather not go.
So if we were to try and distill the key takeaways from Jonah's, shall we say, rather unique journey, what would they be? What can we really learn from this deep dive into the book of Jonah?
Well, I think there are a few key things to keep in mind. First, obedience is rarely easy. It often means stepping outside our comfort zones, facing our fears, and sometimes even embracing the unknown. I mean, Jonah's reluctance to go to Nineveh. That's a pretty clear example of how tempting it can be to run from God's call, especially when it challenges our preconceived notions or disrupts our comfortable routines.
Makes you think, doesn't it? About all the times we've resisted doing what we know we're supposed to do simply because it's hard or uncomfortable.
Exactly. And yet, the book of Jonah shows us that God is incredibly patient with us, even when we mess up, even when we make bad choices. He doesn't give up.
It's like he keeps offering us second chances.
Right. He keeps pursuing us, gently guiding us back to the path he's laid out for us. Jonah's story, as wild as it is a powerful reminder that God can use even the most reluctant of followers to accomplish his purposes.
And I think the second takeaway, maybe the most important one, is that we're called to expand our capacity for compassion, to recognize the humanity in all people, even those we might consider our enemies.
Yeah, I mean, Jonah's struggle with this is a reflection of our own tendency to judge, isn't it? To categorize people based on our limited understanding.
We build walls, we create divisions, and we often miss out on the opportunity to see people as God sees them, capable of change, worthy of forgiveness, and ultimately loved beyond measure.
And the story of Nineveh's repentance. It's such a powerful reminder that change is always possible, even in the most unlikely of places. It's a call to move beyond our preconceived notions, to let go of those prejudices and judgments, and to embrace a God whose love truly knows no bounds.
And the last thing, I think the book of Jonah really underscores this idea of the surprising nature of God. I mean, he doesn't always work in ways we expect. He uses unconventional methods, unusual circumstances to teach us profound truths.
It's like he's constantly challenging our expectations, showing us that his ways are higher than our ways. And sometimes those ways might involve a giant fish, a shady plant, or a gentle rebuke that opens our eyes to a wider perspective.
So what does this all mean for us sitting here listening? How do we take these lessons from Jonah and apply them to our own lives?
Well, I think the book leaves us with a challenge. If even a reluctant, often grumpy prophet like Jonah could be used by God to bring about such dramatic change, what incredible things might be possible in our lives if we surrender to God's will, embrace his love, and truly step into his plan for us?
What walls might we tear down? What bridges could we build? What acts of compassion might we extend to those we previously judged or dismissed?
It's a powerful image to end on, isn't it?
It is. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the book of Jonah, let's remember this. We may not always understand God's ways, his timing, his methods, but we can trust that he is always at work in our lives, always guiding, always inviting us to be part of something bigger, something more meaningful.
Something truly miraculous.
Thanks for joining us on this journey today. We hope you found it insightful, challenging, and maybe even a little bit humorous along the way. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.